Thanks so much, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yvette Butler, Director of Capacity Building and Systems Change at the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. I'm joined by Sarah Wee, Director of Research and Programs, and Erica Sussman, our Founder and Executive Director, who will introduce themselves a bit more fully in a few moments. Also, a quick shout out to Sandy Van Orden from OVW. She is likely a participant as well, and may or may not throw out a few questions later on. Thanks for joining us today for this project launch. So, as many of you know from registering for the launch webinar, our Access project is about addressing the many financial hardships or costs that are connected to domestic violence and sexual assault. Legal advocates already do so much to help survivors, and we started this project to help support advocates by making sure that they have the knowledge, skills, and strategies to help survivors address the many costs that they face. We want to start out by giving a bit of perspective on the evolution of our work and how we developed the project, and there will be many places in the webinar where you'll be able to share your rich expertise with us. You can really think of this project as like a choose your own adventure, and that will become apparent very soon. So today, the purpose of the webinar is to introduce all of you to the scope and activities of the Access project. So first we'll give you an overview of CSAJ's mission and our approach to advocacy. Then we'll discuss more details of the new project, and like I mentioned, the project is for you and other advocates working in a space where survivors need your assistance with legal advocacy. The activities that we have planned are all really an opportunity for all of you to interact with peers, tell us what you're facing or missing as advocates so we can be sure to provide you with what you need. And finally, we want to hear what you see in your work. We want to find out what you're doing as it relates to addressing the cost of DV and SA. And as we go, whether there's a question posed to the audience or not, we'd love for folks to share what they do, where they're from, any questions they have, and any comments on the content that we present. So while Sarah and Erica are introducing CSAJ and themselves, it'd be great if you could all tell us about yourself, whether you're in an organization, your role within that organization, the type of work you do, the geographic area in which you work. That would all be really great. So now I'll hand it over to Erica to talk about CSAJ's work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yvette. And welcome, everybody. We are thrilled to have you with us today. I cannot emphasize enough how excited we are to have Yvette Butler, who is our new-ish Director of Capacity Building and Systems Change, at the helm of this really critical project work. And we are very excited to be working with all of you, advocates in many places and spaces across the country, who really are the heart of the domestic and sexual violence movement. For decades, since the inception of this movement, this movement in its sort of current incarnation, this work has really been driven by advocates working side by side with survivors in communities across the country. And so we are really honored to be able to lift up the critical work that you all are doing each day, to be able to have a space to share that work in partnership, and also to be able to think together about ways to address some of the really substantial costs that result from domestic and sexual violence. So very much looking forward to embarking on this with all of you. As Yvette said, I'll give you a quick introduction to CSAJ generally for those who are new to our organization or are just continuing on this journey with us. CSAJ is a national organization, and we have a very ambitious vision, which is that we envision a world where all people have equal access to physical physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And we carry out that vision or aim toward that vision through our mission statement, which is that CSAJ promotes advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, enhance organizational responses, and improve professional practices to meet the self-defined needs of domestic and sexual violence survivors. That mission statement is really encapsulated in this graphic that's on this particular slide. Here you can see the way in which CSAJ carries out our work across programs, and we approach the work from a multi-level perspective. So at the individual level, we work with advocates and attorneys and programs to enhance individual advocacy. That individual advocacy work takes into account both the economic working, whether it's through demonstration site work or through close partnership with organizations and communities to really strengthen the economic advocacy work that's being done. And we do that by linking up in partnership with domestic violence, anti-poverty organizations, as well as anti-racism advocates and community members that really results in an approach that centers survivors' intersecting needs. And then at the systems level, we work from local to federal efforts to remove institutional barriers and to identify and implement laws, policies, and engage in impactful systemic change. So that three-leveled approach is very much at the center of the way that CSAJ does our work, and I think will also be reflected in the way in which this project carries out its own work as well. So very excited to sort of share that big picture with you all, and now I'll be handing this off to Sarah Wee, our Director of Research and Programs.
Hi, thank you so much. This is Sarah. I am, as Erica said, CSAJ's Director of Research and Programs. I'm so thrilled to be here. And before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge the amazing folks who are in the room. As Erica was talking, I saw we have folks from Montana to North Carolina, from legal services organizations, immigrant survivor advocates, attorney and non-attorney advocates, culturally specific advocates. So this is amazing. I'm really thrilled. I think we're all thrilled to really learn from you all. So keep the thoughts and questions and conversation coming, because that's what this webinar is really all about. And so to start that off, I'm going to introduce a little bit more of CSAJ's own framework that has informed, as Erica was saying, not only this project, but really all of CSAJ's work. And so in doing so, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you right off the bat. Kind of what's your framework? How do you approach the work? What's important to the way that you work with survivors? What does safety mean to you? What do you think about when you hear the words economic security or cost or any of the language that we've sort of been using right now? It'd be great to get a sense of where you're all coming from, or maybe even questions that you're bringing today. So on this slide, this is a really critical illustration, really, of how we think about this work at CSAJ. There's a really strong and clear link between poverty and domestic violence that's well substantiated by researchers, service providers, and advocates such as yourselves, and really survivors of violence from across the country. And what this shows is that abuse creates profound economic hardship for survivors, and poverty in turn further restricts survivors' options for safety, which makes them more vulnerable to future violence. So how does this show up? If you look at that graph right there, while we know and often talk about the fact that around 1 in 4 or 1 in 3, which is 25% of all women, regardless of race, class, and other socioeconomic factors, will experience violence in their lifetime, we also know that more than half of homeless women, or 1 in 2, will report physical abuse and violence by an intimate partner, and more than 70%, so around 3 in 4, women receiving public benefits report abuse from a former partner at some point in their lives. So this, what we call a reciprocal relationship of abuse and poverty, makes women living in poverty twice as likely to experience domestic violence as women who are not living in poverty. And I'm just looking at some of the comments here, and I think, yeah, the idea and the critical piece of keeping goals in mind and how you work with survivors coming from different life experiences is critical to this work. So thank you for sharing that, and keep doing so. So let's zoom in on this ripple effect a little bit more. So all forms of abuse can lead to economic hardship for survivors. But more recently, the field has begun to explore the phenomenon and the impact of what's called economic abuse. And this was started really in a study in 2008 by a researcher out of Michigan State University, Adrian Adams, along with some colleagues, who developed a scale of economic abuse that really sought to better understand what are the ways that abusive partners use economic finances to control, coerce, and survivors. And so they held in-depth interviews with over 100 women receiving residential services, and as a result, they were able to really look at these different factors, which is laid out here, where economic abuse involves behaviors that control a woman's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening her economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. And what they found was that 99% of the women who they interviewed and who were involved in this study were subjected to economic abuse at some point in their relationship. And since then, there have been additional studies that have really validated this finding. So anywhere from 94 to 99% of survivors experience some form of economic abuse, and this is much higher than rates of physical abuse as well. Importantly, within this that we really look at are two major categories of economic abuse that they talk about: economic control and economic exploitation. Economic control is things like limiting or preventing the use of economic resources, and we saw that show up in some more recent research where 71% of survivors report that their partners keep important financial information from them. So that's a way of controlling in that instance. Another example is economic exploitation. So that's sabotaging, intentionally depleting resources, limiting survivors' options to create and maintain their own resources. And one example of that, which we've trained on before, and I'm sure you have all experienced, is what we call coerced debt. And over half of survivors report that their abusive partners have put debt in their name through either fraudulent or coercive tactics. And the impact of that is not only, having these massive debts, but what that does to one's access to things like housing, employment, even utilities, and other services. So it'd be great to kind of hear how this resonates with you all. Are there particular instances or tactics of economic control and exploitation that you see generating some of the profound costs that kind of brought you to this webinar and made you curious about what this project is about? I'd love to hear a few examples. So even one thing that Janet just mentioned is the fact that there are few services, so what abusive partners can do in restricting access to services, be they domestic violence services or other social and community services that a person might need. Other folks are saying housing and how abusive partners can kind of sabotage anything from damaging housing, creating costs, to creating evictions, putting survivors' names on leases without their knowing about it, and then not paying rent, all sorts of things like that. Taking out loans in victims' names, not paying child support as required, absolutely.
I would also just underscore a lot of these issues are, of course, interconnected. So folks are talking about housing and childcare access, and we, of course, know that many of the debt-related issues or some of these economic abuse tactics create the circumstances for making housing, for example, inaccessible, or for making employment access inaccessible. So some of our thinking, I anticipate, will be around making those linkages between some of the economic abuses and how we might be able to address them to avoid some of the bigger barriers that occur in terms of childcare access, housing access, employment access that folks are lifting up.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads right to this, where the impact of all of these interrelated acts, as Erica was describing, really leads to multiple negative economic outcomes for survivors. I'll just repeat: income and job loss, housing stability, limited transportation, access to child care. And we know that survivors say that a lot of their economic hardship is the result of their abusive partner. And so we know this not only from research, but from talking and working with folks such as yourself, with communities that are doing that work to try to link experiences of abuse and poverty and limited resources to these big issues, as Erica was saying, like housing and employment. And so taken all together, this sort of creates a pathway or a story that the economic impacts really lead to decreased safety options, limiting options and choices, and an ability to move through the world that will secure safety and long-term well-being. And that in turn creates increased risk for future violence. So it'd be great to hear similarly. I've already seen a lot of housing, but if any of these particular negative economic outcomes really resonate with you, or a thing that you as an individual or maybe your organization is most kind of concerned with or grappling with right now.
There's been a lot of conversation, and some of the things that I've appreciated are particular to, for example, immigrant survivors and some of the barriers that folks are facing in terms of even trying to access transportation and yet being fearful of getting stopped by ICE, for example. Some folks have raised the challenges related to immigrant survivors in terms of just being able to access benefits and access other forms of legal representation, as well as other resources. So appreciate that particular attention.
Mm-hmm.
Transportation several times as well.
Yeah. And I live in New York City, and our public transportation fares just increased, and although it's not a ton on its face, we know that it's now $3 per ride, and we know it's more expensive to have to get a Metro card for each ride than it is to buy monthly or even longer passes. And so the costs of poverty are actually more expensive than other options. And then that's compounded by a lot of the immigration related and other barriers that folks mentioned. So that's a really, really important structural factor to think about. And so, of course, these economic impacts, as you all know, are not confined or constrained to the relationship. They're not one-off incidents that we can often easily resolve. They really linger, and in fact, they compound and continue to interlock and influence one another throughout the lifespan of a given survivor. So what you see here is a model attempting to illustrate what we call the economic ripple effect of domestic violence. And this was based off of some research done by former CSAJ research director and researcher Sarah Schoner, along with Erica, to really map out what does this look like in the long term. And the point of this and what it really challenges us all to do as advocates is to identify and understand some of the long-term economic consequences of violence that survivors face so that we can really adapt and reflect our advocacy strategies to better match and interrupt what that long-term pathway looks like. And then in contrast, we end up creating more opportunities for survivors to create economic security and develop new pathways toward well-being. So you can take a look here, and I'm sure could share a lot of your own stories about economic issues survivors maybe presented to you when during your first visit, how those changed over the short term, and even with some survivors where you see them now or what you've learned that their long-term hardships are if you're working with them or if you see them down the road. So it'd be great, again, to see how this ripple effect shows up for you, and many of you have already tapped into it with what you've shared. Even things, and this is the critical piece that this project really is trying to get at, is focus on kind of what access issues in this ripple effect are important to attend to interrupt this pathway. So it's things like survivors being embedded in service systems, or survivors, as someone was saying, kind of slipping through the cracks, and these issues not being identified. Those are some of the things that are really important to attend to that this project is really focused on. So I'm actually going to come back to that. Just to extend this water metaphor a little bit, and a really important undercurrent through this ripple effect are the systemic barriers that get in the way of survivors' access to economic stability. And we're going to really get into more of this very soon. This is what this project is all about. So through CSAJ's past projects, we've identified 3 ways that these barriers show up: via limited resource ability, poor service response, and the impact of policies. So what does that mean? With limited resource ability, this includes everything, as many of you have mentioned already, few or dispersed services, low housing stock, to things simply like the cost to travel, the hours and time it takes, hours of operation. All of these things determine a survivor's ability to access certain services and systems. As a result, courts, services, even our own shelters and programs can prove inaccessible to survivors, particularly those with limited means. Poor service response. This is often something that we call gatekeeping, and these are the attitudes or perceptions of people within institutions who control access to resources. They can deter, disparage, and even deny survivors options for economic security. And I think this also showed up in the immigration example, thinking about what might deter a survivor from, for example, going to court, seeking legal services, seeking support for domestic violence, given some of the complexities around that. And then finally, the impact of policies. So this happens on multiple levels, including organizational policies, as well as bigger picture state, national laws and policies that have a unique effect on survivors, which is often called disparate impact. So organizational policies might include things like eligibility requirements for certain services, benefits, even access to shelters. And then examples of some larger policies are things like nuisance ordinances that might result in eviction because a survivor has called the police for help, and things like credit and employment checks for housing, employment, and other services, which, because of what we just discussed, survivors face particular barriers with their credit and therefore access to these big issues that are important for long-term economic stability. And there are a host of others, and that is really going to kind of tease apart these costs a little bit more once we get into the access project. So there'll be even more opportunity to kind of flesh some of these things out. I'm seeing a lot of conversation that I haven't been able to keep a close eye on, so I don't know if Eric or Yvette, there's anything you want to lift up or address while we're here.
The most recent comment that I just spotted that I think is really just speaking to the many ways in which advocates further this work is Patricia, who is sharing the ways in which she helps with survivors' advocacy on so many different levels, one of them being focused specifically on helping folks to understand the stages of the criminal justice system so that they're better able to navigate the risks that emerge from that system and also weigh their strategies against that larger systemic context, which for me just really highlights the fact that so much of advocates' roles are about that navigating function and about helping to think about not just batterer-generated risks, but risks that are actually posed by the systems themselves.
Absolutely. That's a great example. So finally, the final riptide in this ripple effect is the factor of social inequality. So as you can see here, across all races, the greatest predictor of intimate partner violence is income. It's anywhere from a half to almost 2/3 of the causes to violence from this one study. And yet at the same time, just as earlier we showed that women living in poverty are much more likely to experience violence, those who are marginalized by virtue of race, ethnicity, citizenship, language, religion, sexuality, gender identity are much more likely to experience both abuse as well as more likely to be impoverished by virtue of these systemic barriers and access issues and the ways that our systems are set up. So working through these multiple economic as well as structural, as well as social and identity lenses is really critical to the task. And these are sort of the foundations upon which CSAJ has really developed all of our programming, and that's why I just kind of end here on some of our other projects: Consumer Rights for Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors Initiative, the Racial and Economic Equity Project, and an Accounting for Economic Security Atlas project. And this is all to say that based on over a decade of work, we've really tried to attend to this ripple effect and this framework by pulling what we would call critical levers for change within that. And these are things like equipping advocates, attorneys with ways to practice and enhance survivor-centered advocacy that does hold the economic realities of survivors at the same time, a focus on building partnerships, enhancing and lifting up innovative, grassroots, community-based, culturally specific ways that organizations support all of that work, and then of course linking all of this to powerful and transformative change within our communities as well as in with systems. And so with that, it looks like folks are really the conversation is going really well, so I'm going to pass it over to Yvette to really dig into this. I don't know if there are any questions before we do go into the project itself.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. It looks like there is one question about some examples of system-generated risk. So maybe we want to just like quickly touch on that before moving on, although it looks like somebody might be answering that question. But Aaron, do you want to touch on that really quickly?
Yes, it does look like somebody is answering that question, so I'll be excited to hear about what looks like might be Patricia's answer to that question. Some like very common examples that I would highlight would simply be, if somebody calls law enforcement at the time of a domestic violence incident, we know that simply engaging with the police presents huge risks, particularly for marginalized communities, whether that leads to dual arrest or other consequences that may pose even greater dangers to survivors' physical and economic safety. So that would be one example. Other examples might be seeking legal assistance and finding that it triggers an investigation by Child Protective Services, which then leads to a cascading number of consequences in terms of a survivor's children and all of the negative impacts that that's going to create. So somebody else earlier had talked just about the particular vulnerabilities that immigrant survivors face in trying to access assistance and some of the immigration consequences that might ensue. So many, many examples. I'm sure all of you could offer up some just from your own practice. So, yes.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, I just want to say wow, because there's a lot of really great information being like passed in the chat, so please keep it up. So now I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the Access project. The purpose is to work with non-lawyer legal advocates to address the costs and remove the systemic economic barriers and inequities related to domestic violence and sexual assault. So earlier in our framework, we were talking about the economic ripple effect of intimate partner violence, and CV and SA has a huge impact on whether someone incurs debt or other expenses as a result of the abuse that they suffered. So really we wanted to help support legal advocates develop their expertise in addressing these costs. As you've noticed, we use the term non-lawyer legal advocate quite a bit, so we wanted to address that really quickly. And so really based on the OVW solicitation, we considered non-lawyer legal advocates to be advocates who do not have a law license to engage in legal advocacy, and do things like safety planning, court accompaniment, clinics, and all of the other activities that everybody has talked so much about that touch on legal issues or help individuals with their legal cases. So really we're talking about advocates of many, many kinds who engage in the legal system in a multitude of ways. And so sort of like our three-pronged approach to CSAJ's own work, the goals of the project really mirror that approach and are to enhance non-lawyer legal advocates' capacity to engage in individual advocacy, to help survivors one-on-one, building partnerships with other advocates, lawyers, organizations, community members, and more, to strengthen the organizational community response to costs, because I think as everybody sees, there are so many interconnecting issues that not only one advocate or one organization can tackle on their own. So having those partnerships, many of which a lot of you have already, is vital. And then finally, to break down the structural barriers to economic security and physical safety. So this is a quick shout out to our project partners. We have several vital partners that are helping out on the project, and they all bring important perspectives. They provide individual advocacy for underserved or culturally specific survivors. So absolutely a lot of those immigration concerns are on our radar. Others have expertise in partnership building, systems change, and addressing systemic inequality. So we've been talking a lot about costs, and many of you identified some costs earlier, but sort of as Sarah promised, I wanted to break them down a little bit. So through insights that we have learned throughout CSAJ's history, we began to see a critical gap in access to justice work as focused on the full cost of violence. And so we really broke down those costs into 4 categories: cost of abuse, lives generated, cost of service and justice systems, and lack of legal representation. So to dive into those more specifically, and definitely jump in if any of these seem familiar to you or you have anything to add that might be missing. First is the batter-generated cost. That can be anything from physical abuse, which leads to medical expenses, and abuser harassing a survivor at work and compromising her employment prospects. And we're curious how you all conceptualize this. So it looks like some of you have already mentioned that you've experienced this. Does this look familiar to anybody, or are there any other batter-generated costs that you feel like are important to address that I didn't talk about here? And while we're waiting for folks to type, so if Sarah or Erica has anything you wanted to add.
I would just say that this goes back to some of the conversation that you all started back when we were talking about economic abuse and efforts to both control and exploit, and the critical link that you made to how that plays with bigger issues like housing and employment and things like that. So I think you all shared some really critical insights on how all of these things link together.
Absolutely. Great. So, and life-generated costs. I think many of us are very familiar with these, in part because we all have life-generated costs, and survivors often face huge barriers because of these costs. So a lot of you have already mentioned, like, transportation is huge, housing is huge, there's food, utilities, healthcare, having affordable childcare is huge. And then it also manifests in structural inequality. So for example, there are, in Black neighborhoods, or when we're talking about culturally specific barriers, we know that there are issues with Black lenders receiving worse terms than others, and the rate of collections judgments is twice as high in mostly Black neighborhoods as in white neighborhoods. So yeah, a lot of you have already mentioned that these life-generated costs are huge, and that addressing some of those really helps stabilize survivors' lives. And there are costs of navigating the service system. So survivors have to take time off of work or just time out of their days to access the services they need, whether that's legal, housing, medical, therapy, like any other services, and they need childcare and transportation to do that a lot of the time. Some folks mentioned the issue of people not having driver's licenses and the cost of being caught without a license. It could be a fine or a fee, or it could be something big like being caught by ICE. And others mentioned some language access issues in, not only in courts, but also sometimes in shelters. And then finally, there's the lack of legal representation that survivors often lack, but luckily they have advocates, and really these numbers here are just to demonstrate that there are barriers to accessing legal advocacy and non-lawyer advocacy, and that a combination of legal representation and advocacy are most helpful to people's lives, and really advocates are the bridge to the justice system, which again is why we wanted to work with you all to be able to address costs when other legal representation may not be available. So I want to pause here and see if anybody has any questions before I move on to some of the project activities. Oh, and okay, so I also see this comment from Lori about, clients taking time off work and then are the last on the docket, and having to pay for an interpreter when an interpreter is available. So the lack of interpreters, I have also heard that as an issue, especially in some rural areas, or when interpreters aren't available for certain languages. Oh, so I also see a comment about unauthorized practice of law. So it'd also be interesting to get into that a bit later. Cool. So, all right. So the main activities of the Access Project, there's going to be an in-person 2-day institute, the Access Institute, which stands for Accounting for Costs to Ensure Survivor Safety. It will be in 2020 and then again in 2021. And many of our activities in 2019 will be in preparation of the Institute in 2020. And so other things that are available to advocates are individual technical assistance that CSAJ will provide. There will be a webinar training, and I think most exciting are the peer exchange calls, which start in June. For 2019, we are planning to have these with a geographic focus, so definitely be on the lookout for more information on those. It's going to be a regular space for advocates to connect, learn, and exchange information with each other, because again, the partnership piece is such an important aspect of this. All right, so we got into this a bit earlier, but how are you currently addressing some of the barriers that we talked about? We spent a lot of time talking about the barriers that impede survivors' access to economic security and safety, but what are you or your organizations currently doing to help alleviate some of those barriers? And while folks are typing, I know that a couple of people mentioned providing housing. So I forgot who mentioned this, but in being able to provide some housing, it helps sort of relieve some of the stresses. Let's see, some people taking statements to help survivors who speak another language.
Looks like some people are exploring online legal self-help tools and resources, partnering with their coalitions to fill some language access gaps. Yeah, and it would be great to hear kind of. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to ask more questions. It would be great to hear what folks are doing, going back to how Erica laid out our levels of impact, things that you might be doing individually, things that your organization are doing, partnerships that have been really helpful, and even systems change initiatives that you're engaged in. So breaking it down to those levels would be interesting to hear about as well.
I see a number of examples where different organizations are offering basically funding to cover discrete costs that survivors face, whether it's in terms of transportation or child care access or utility help. It seems like being able to offer sums of money to address some of these, which is wonderful to hear about. I'm also wondering if there are examples of, which gets at like the question in the right-hand column of this slide, ways in which folks are addressing debt and other economic barriers, and particularly in the legal context, if there are examples of that, we'd love to hear about that too. Some folks are talking about legal services and sort of different family law matters. Yeah, in the custody context, some of the economic barriers that folks face simply in trying to navigate the custody process, which is critical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Partnership with legal services as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and for those who mentioned partnership with legal services in family law, is there attention paid to things like debt and navigating the economic hardship, or how would you talk about that partnership?
There is some mention, Brenda makes some mention of some of the assistance that she has provided in terms of advocating financial institutions and some of the impacts of economic abuse, I'm imagining, on folks' credit in that way, being able to serve context.
And just to say really quickly, I think this is where it gets really interesting to know how things differ based on people's geographic location. Because somebody mentioned earlier about being accused of unlawfully practicing law when they help clients that are illiterate fill out forms. but I know in other jurisdictions, like some advocates can do much more than fill out forms, and occasionally even come to court and speak on behalf of somebody. So I would be interested in just the range of activities that non-lawyers engage in your jurisdiction, whether that's finding forms, filling out forms, giving information on the court process. I know somebody mentioned like giving information on the criminal process earlier. Let's see. A lot of people provide emotional support, like helping somebody go to court and being there as support. Others help clients organize their information and materials. So I'm really interested in really like the breadth of advocacy that you all engage in. And again, as you know, linking it all back to the costs of TV and essay. Oh, and I see a comment from Charlie about once safety has been addressed, finances quickly become the focus. And that's usually a holistic focus with the attorneys. Great. So I definitely want people to keep typing because there are a lot of people typing right now. But I am going to go to the next slide. Well, before I do, just to highlight Camille's question, is there a line between non-lawyer legal advocacy and non-lawyer non-legal advocacy? Let's see. And Erica, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that, and I'm happy to give some of mine.
I mean, I guess to me, the way that I'm thinking about this is the ways in which advocates and lawyers can work together to meet the legal advocacy needs of survivors. So sometimes that advocacy may show up in the form of like a legal setting. An advocate may be doing work in a legal setting. Sometimes that advocate may be doing work that supports legal advocacy carried out by an attorney. So an example of that, Lori highlights an example of helping a survivor to process an ITIN number. And I would imagine, I mean, that's a perfect example and an unbelievably important example of advocacy work that is then going to help further survivors access, for example, in any type of both economic outside of a courtroom setting as well as even in a consumer law setting. So that type of partnership between an advocate and an attorney is furthering legal advocacy. And folks are talking about all different ways here that I'm seeing that are kind of in furtherance of access to legal justice. So that's kind of how I'm conceptualizing it. Sometimes it's going to be an advocate participating in sort of a legal process, and other times it could be offering a safety context or trying to access other resources that will drive legal advocacy.
Yeah, great. And that's, I think we're sort of thinking about this in the same way, you know, like what advocates do to help further somebody's legal case, whether they have or don't have a lawyer. And, you know, that's sort of being able to find information that would be helpful for a case and help somebody navigate the system are what really come to mind for me.
Yeah, Brenda, Hannah, and Charlie are all identifying really.
We're talking about that. Yeah, I was just noticing that too.
Being able to obtain a fee waiver would be a really excellent example that has huge economic consequences that help folks access legal justice. Let's see what else. Hannah's
not only.
Yeah.
I was just going to lift up what Charlie was saying, that not only working with survivors in legal cases, but attending a range of court hearings, including civil and criminal, discussing legal criteria. So really understanding the process and walking through the process, which was talked about earlier before, and just kind of the image that comes to mind is like getting fingers pruny with how systems work and feel is a critical role, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Patricia makes a good point about how advocates are often, I think, more available to give survivors more of their time. And she also mentioned like testimony prep. Somebody mentioned that in the registration questions from earlier. They're helping to prep testimony, translate documents, help survivors with their victim compensation claims, providing referrals, of course, safety planning, which has been mentioned. Some people mentioned providing restraining order or protection order assistance. If anybody who does that is able to sort of highlight what part they play in that role of helping to get those restraining or protection orders, I think it would be helpful to know, because again, like some advocates are able to play more of a role than others, just depending upon where they are located.
Mm-hmm. And then Lori is also bringing up some important partnership issues. We see some of kind of building on what Yvette was saying, particularly in rural areas where there might not be a lot of or any legal services or free or low-cost legal services. Domestic violence organizations and programs have developed really innovative ways to enhance access to legal services. So maybe have developed a pro bono network, but maybe these attorneys aren't steeped in domestic violence, sexual assault, immigrant survivors. And so there's a real need for cross-training and advocates working in partnership and making that not just a referral process, but really bringing that together. And Lori's talking about how sometimes there can be barriers in working with attorneys and navigating the role of an advocate, be it as translator, as support, as knowledgeable of the systems. And so thinking about ways that that we could attend to that is really critical. So thanks for sharing some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. So, great. While people are still typing, now I'll switch to the next slide. There's more we want to get from you all. And Anna, I believe this is where we need the poll. There's going to be a poll question. And really, this is more about what training and experiences you've had entering into your role as an advocate. Because some people sought formal education specifically to be an advocate. Some people receive on-the-job training, maybe both. Others come from life experience that makes them excellent advocates. So really we just want to ask, sort of get a sense of where people where people are coming from in terms of where they got their training.
Mm-hmm. And it'd be helpful to hear in the chat as folks are doing that, what training or experience has been most impactful or most helpful to the work that you do day in and day out. I know that some of the formal education and training I got is helpful for some things, but I've brought a lot of different experience into work with CSAJ and other places. So it'd be really interesting to hear the types of training and experience building that's been most helpful to you as an advocate.
And while the responses are coming in, it looks like most people have some sort of formal education. Most have had training in like trauma-informed care, safety planning, and other survivor advocacy. Most people have had training on legal advocacy, so client interviewing, court procedure, things like that. Some come from personal experience, learning by, a lot have been, a lot of you, actually I think most people checked learn by doing, so learning on the job through volunteer work otherwise, which, you know, is one of the best ways to learn things. And about 50% of you have had training on court access or navigating court and legal systems. So this is all really interesting information. Looks like some responses are still coming in, but while those are coming in, feel free to, in the chat box, expand on the training. And to also let us know, based on what you've heard today and on your own experience, what are maybe the top three issues, topics, or barriers this project should be most attentive to. So, you know, whether that's what kind of training you feel like would be most helpful. I know in some of people's registration responses, they're like, you know, we need solid strategies to take back to our clients. You know, I think some people want to know more about partnerships and how to address systemic inequalities. You know, we'd really like to know, like, what issues, barriers, topics would be most helpful. So definitely like the economic abuse, housing, really important. How to access meaningful language access, affordable legal representation that is effective.
We're talking about both affordable and effective legal advocacy and representation. I think that's an important question to think about, the cause and effect of different advocacy strategies. Housing and other legal recourses. See both training on building your individual legal advocacy and how to build partnerships with attorneys, kind of like in the ways Erica was talking about. Great. More specific training on custody, guardian matters.
Somebody framed it in terms of legal accountability for financial abuse, which is I feel like really critical and an area worth exploring some more. I know that, oftentimes our focus is on the family law space, but we also know that many of these financial issues are happening or could be happening in other legal contexts, whether, a whole slew of different consumer law related spaces. And so how might advocates be able to partner with attorneys in new spaces as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, building relationships and partnerships with local attorneys. Yeah, I know for a lot of folks, whether it's just because maybe legal aid is at capacity, or maybe like the lack of legal services or affordable legal services in an area, that pro bono can be especially important. So yeah, that relationship piece is definitely vital. Oh yeah, low bono. Pro bono and low bono. Great. So yeah, so I sort of asked some of this already. So, but more on, yeah, so focusing on the skills people want to build. There's a lot here about partnerships. Is there anything else that you would like to learn, or anything that you would like to be doing in your work that you're not currently, and how could the project support that? Alternatively, what are you most looking forward to? We mentioned the 2-day in-person institute, peer exchange calls, technical assistance. Is there anything that you're like, yes, I can't wait for this to happen? Your calls. I know somebody had mentioned in the questions before the webinar that they really wanted peer exchange calls in like a geographic area, really to learn from, people that they are close to geographically. Partnerships where you're not seen as a threat or competition. That's an interesting point, Lori. If you could expand on that a little bit, maybe have you had experiences where you were considered a threat or competition, and was that by attorneys, other advocates?
Somebody's talking about the role of advocates in accessing economic relief in protection orders. Lots of space to do that.
Mm-hmm.
From evidence gathering to providing the fuller context of how economic relief meets the overarching goal of protection order statutes, which is safety. Advocates are critical in doing that work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I see the competition between agencies and community-based organizations. The need for culturally specific services. Yeah. Okay. Great. So now, while some of the last responses are coming in, really the final thing is, what would make this project more appealing to you? Seems like people are very excited, which is great, but is there anything that, are there any activities or information or anything that would make the project more appealing and get you more excited than you are now?
Or speaking of access, would make it more accessible to you?
Yeah, good point.
Going back to the previous question a little bit, Hannah, I appreciate the comment about partnership building is also working with financial institutions. So there are some powerful strategies and ways of building partnerships between advocates and attorneys, as well as these systems, as well as some of the financial systems, and thinking about both legal and non-legal economic responsibility and opportunities there. That can be really exciting. Some questions about logistics. Are calls and webinars open to everyone?
So, so Sarah, I'm happy to field this question, unless you wanted to go ahead.
Go for it.
Okay, so I want to say yes. So the project is primarily geared toward LAV funded advocates and organizations. However, let's see, in speaking with OVW the other day, my understanding is that as long as your program manager or grant manager in is okay with non-LAV folks attending, that we're pretty flexible on our end. So calls and webinars should be open. The in-person training should also be open as well. But that's something that we are happy to check on more specifics. But if it's okay with your particular grant manager, there shouldn't be any issues on our end.
Mm-hmm. And Mel, if you have further questions, and that goes for anyone, feel free to email us at any point. We're happy to have a further conversation. And that similarly goes with technical assistance. If a question popped up for you today that you want to dig in on a little bit further, feel free to email us. There are no restrictions to reaching out and asking questions, and we'll hop on the phone, we'll gather some other partners and kind of talk through whatever it is that you're experiencing, and can also talk about other ways to get you engaged in that process. LAV stands for Legal Assistance to Victims Program. It's a specific program funded through the Office on Violence Against Women.
Yes, Lori is mentioning Casa de Esperanza as an unbelievable resource, and agreed. They are one of the partners on this project as well, alongside many other really powerful, culturally specific partners who will be working with all of you and us.
And I also want to highlight that there's going to be a workbook that's released after the Institute, so there will also be a written resource in case, folks aren't able to attend the Institute. A written resource will be made available. But yes, so feel free to email us with any of your, are we allowed to attend questions. We definitely want as many folks to attend as possible. And yeah, Sarah, Erica, do you have anything to add?
I guess I just want to, I don't want to get lost in, what I do not want to get lost is the really insightful comments that came up just a few minutes ago, which I think we're just kind of bringing to the surface some of the issues around really power within organizations and across communities as it relates to advocacy relationships, whether that's the relationship between lawyers and advocates, between mainstream organizations and community-based, culturally specific organizations, and really sort of what are all of our roles, what are all of the roles that people can play given where they're situated. In many ways it is connected to some of the work that we recently were involved in our Showing Up report, where folks, advocates, were really working to identify sort of where they are situated and how they can best leverage their role. So I'm very appreciative of you raising that and very much looking forward to diving into that as part of this project with all of you.
Great. So that's all. Thanks everybody for participating. There was so much richness in the chat, and we're really excited to start this project with you all.
Yeah, I would re-encourage everybody to make sure you complete the evaluation after the webinar, which will ask a few more questions that will help us do kind of what Erica was talking about, get an understanding of the different things that you think are important that we can embed into whether it's the institute, the in-person institute, or some of the other activities. We're really learning from you all so that we can best attend to some of the needs and interests and connections that you all are making today. So thank you so much. Really grateful.